August Derleth and Mark Shorer's The Return of Andrew Bentley. It is with considerable hesitation that I here chronicle the strange incidents which marked my short stay at the old Wilder homestead on the banks of the Wisconsin River, not far from the rustic village of Sache Prairie. My reluctance is not entirely dispelled by the conviction that some record of these events should emphatically be made, if only to stop the circulation of unfounded rumors which have come into being since my departure from the vicinity. The singular chain of events began with a peremptory letter from my aging uncle, Amos Wilder, ordering me to appear at the homestead, where he was then living with a housekeeper and caretaker. Communications from my Uncle Amos were not only exceedingly rare, but usually tinged with biting and withering comments about my profession of letters, which he held in great scorn. Previous to this note, we had not seen each other for over 4 years. His curt note hinted that there was something of vital importance to both of us which he wished to take up with me, and though I had no inkling of what this might be, I did not hesitate to go. The old house was not large. It stood well back in the rambling grounds, its white surface mottled by the shadows of leafy branches and the warm sunlight of the day on which I arrived. Green shutters crowded upon the windows, and the door was tightly closed, despite the day's somnolent warmth. The river was cerulean and silver in the immediate background, and farther beyond, the bluffs on the other side of the river rose from behind the trees and were lost in a blue haze of the distance to the north and south. My uncle had grown incredibly old, and now hobbled about with the aid of a cane. On the morning of my arrival he was dressed in a long, ragged black robe that trailed along the floor. Beneath the garment he wore a threadbare black jersey and a pair of shabby trousers. His hair was unkempt, and on his chin was a rough beard, masking his thin, sardonic mouth. His eyes, however, had lost none of their fire, and I felt his disapproval of me as clearly as ever. His expression was that of a man who is faced with an unpleasant but necessary task. At last, after a rude scrutiny, he began to speak, having first made certain that no one lurked within earshot.
"It's hardly necessary for me to say I'm not too certain I've done a wise thing in choosing you," he began. "I've always considered you somewhat of a milksop. You've done nothing to change my opinion."
He watched my face closely as he spoke, to detect any resentment that I might feel, but I had heard this kind of speech from him too often before to feel any active anger. He sensed this, apparently, for he went on abruptly.
"I'm going to leave everything I've got to you, but there'll be a condition. You'll have to spend most of your time here. Make this your home, of course, and there are 1 or 2 other small things you'll have to see to. Mind, I'm not putting anything in my will. I want only your word. Do you think you can give it? Think you can say yes to my terms?"
He paused, and I said, "I see no reason why I shouldn't, if you can guarantee that your terms won't interfere with my writing." My uncle smiled and shook his head as if in exasperation.
"Nothing is easier," he replied curtly. "Your time for writing will be virtually unlimited."
"What do you want me to do?" I asked.
"Spend most of your time here, as I said before. You'd let no day go by during which you do not examine the vault behind the house. My body will lie there, and the vault will be sealed. I want to know that I can depend upon you to prevent anything from entering that vault. If at any time you discover that someone has been tampering, you will find written instructions for your further procedure at my library desk. Will you promise me to attend to these things without too much curiosity concerning them?"
I promised without the slightest hesitation, though there were perplexing thoughts crowded upon my mind. Amos Wilder turned away, his eyes glittering. Then he looked through the window directly opposite me and began to chuckle in a curiously guttural tone. At last he said, his eyes fixed upon a patch of blue sky beyond the tree near the window,
Good. I'll block him yet. Amos Wilder is still a match for you. Do you hear, Andrew?
What his words might portend I had no means of knowing, for he turned abruptly to me and said in his clipped, curt way,
You must go now, Alice. I shall not see you again.
With that he left the room, and as if by magic old Jacob Kinney, the caretaker, appeared to show me from the grounds, his lugubrious face regarding me with apologetic eyes from the doorway through which his master had so abruptly vanished but a moment before. My uncle's strange words puzzled me, and it occurred to me that the old man was losing his mind. That I then did him an injustice I subsequently learned, but at the time all evidence pointed to mental derangement. I finally contented myself with this explanation, though it did not account for the old man's obvious rationality during most of the conversation. 2 points struck me. My uncle had put particular stress upon the suggestion that something might enter his vault, and secondly, what was the meaning of his last words, and to whom was my uncle referring when he said, "I'll block him yet, and Amos Wilder is still a match for you. Do you hear, Andrew?" Conjecture, however, was futile, for since I knew very little of my uncle's personal affairs, any guesses I might have made as to his obscure references, if indeed he was not losing his mind, would be fruitless. I left the old homestead that day in May, only to find myself back there again within 48 hours, summoned by Thomas Weatherby of Seiche Prairie, my uncle's solicitor, whose short telegram apprising me of Amos Wilder's death reached me within 3 hours of my return to the St. Louis apartment which served me as my temporary home. My shock at the news of his sudden death was heightened when I learned that the circumstances surrounding his decease indicated suicide. Weatherby told me the circumstances of my uncle's singular death. It appeared that Jacob Kinney had found the old man in the very room in which he and I had discussed his wishes only a day before. He was seated at the table, apparently asleep. One hand still grasped a pen, and before him lay a sheet of notepaper upon which he had written my name and address, nothing more. It was presumed at first that he had had a heart attack, but a medical examination had brought forth the suspicion that the old man had made away with himself by taking an overdose of veronal. There was, however, considerable reluctance to presume suicide, for an overdose of veronal might just as likely be accident as suicide. Eventually, a coroner's jury decided that my uncle had met his death by accident, but from the first I was convinced that Amos Wilder had killed himself. In the light of subsequent events and of his own cryptic words to me, "I shall not see you again," my suspicion was, I feel, justified, though no definite and conclusive evidence emerged. My uncle was buried, as he had wished, in the long disused family vault behind the house, and the vault was sealed from the outside with due ceremony and in the presence of witnesses. The reading of the will was a short affair, for excepting bequests made to the housekeeper and caretaker, I inherited everything. My living was thus assured, and as my uncle had said, I found the future holding many hours of leisure in which to pursue letters. And yet, despite the apparent rosiness of the outlook, there was from the first a peculiar restraint upon my living in the old homestead. It was indefinable and strange, and numerous small incidents occurred to supplement this odd impression. First, old Jacob Kinney wanted to leave. With a great effort, I persuaded him to stay, and dragged from him his reason for wanting to go. "They've been mighty strange things a-goin' on about this house, Mr. Wilder, all the time your uncle was alive, and I'm afraid things will be going on again after a bit." More than that cryptic utterance I could not get out of him. I took the liberty shortly after to repeat Kinney's words to the housekeeper, Mrs. Selden. The startled expression that passed over her countenance did not escape me, and her immediate assurance that Jake Kinney was in his dotage did not entirely reassure me. Then there was the daily function of examining the seal on the vault. The absurdity of my uncle's request began to grow on me, and my task, trivial as it was, became daily more irritating. Yet, having given my promise, I could do no more than fulfill it. On the third night following my uncle's interment, my sleep was troubled by a recurrent dream which gave me no little thought when I remembered its persistence on the following day. I dreamed that my Uncle Amos stood before me, clad as I had last seen him on the visit just preceding his strange death. He regarded me with his beady eyes, and then abruptly said in a mournful and yet urgent voice,
You must bring Burkhart back here. He forgot to protect me against them. You must get him to do so. If he will not, then see these books on the second shelf of the seventh compartment of my library.
This dream was repeated several times, and it had a perfectly logical basis, which was briefly this. My uncle was buried by Father Burkhart, the Seiche Prairie parish priest, who was not satisfied with the findings of the coroner's jury, and consequently, in the belief that Amos Wilder had killed himself, had refused to bless the grave of a suicide. Yet, what the dream shape of the night before had obviously meant when he spoke of what Father Burkhart had forgotten to do was the blessing of the grave. I spent some time mulling over the solution of the dream, and at length went to see the priest. My efforts, however, were futile. The old man explained his attitude with great patience, and I was forced to agree with him. On the following night the dream recurred, and in consequence, since a visit to Father Burkhart had already failed to achieve the desired effect, I turned, impelled largely by curiosity, to the books on the second shelf of the seventh compartment, indicated by the dream figure of my uncle. From the moment that I opened the first of those books, the entire complexion of the occurrences at the homestead changed inexplicably, and I found myself involved in a chain of incidents, the singularity of which continues to impress me even as I write at this late date. For the books on the second shelf of the seventh compartment in my dead uncle's library were books on black magic, books long out of print and apparently centuries old, for in many of them the print had faded almost to illegibility. The Latin in which most of the books were written was not easily translated, but fortunately it was not necessary for me to search long for the portions indicated by my uncle, for in each book paragraphs were marked for my attention. The subjects of the marked portions were strangely similar. After some difficulty I succeeded in translating the first indicated paragraph to catch my eye. For protection from things that walk in the night, it read, there are many things stalking abroad by darkness, perhaps ghouls, perhaps evil demons lured from outer space by man's own ignorance, perhaps souls isolated in space, havenless and alone, and yet strongly attached to the things of this earth. Let no bodies be exposed to their evil wrath. Let there be all manner of protections for vaults and graves, for the dead as well as the living, for ghouls, incubi, and succubi haunt the near places as well as the far, and seek always to quench the fire of their unholy desire. Take blessed water from a church, and mix it with the blood of a young babe, be it ever so small a measure, and with this cross the grave or the door of the vault thrice at the full of the moon. If this was what my Uncle Amos desired me to do, I knew at once that the task had devolved upon the wrong man, for I could certainly not see myself going about collecting holy water and the blood of a young child, and then performing ridiculous rites over the vault with an odious mixture of the two. I put the books aside and returned to my work, which seemed suddenly more inviting than it had ever been before. Yet what I had read disturbed me, and the suggestion that my uncle had come to believe in the power of black magic, perhaps even more than this for all I knew, was extremely distasteful to me. In consequence, my riding suffered, and immediately after my supper that evening I went for a long walk on the river bank. A half moon high in the sky made the countryside bright and clear, and since the night was balmy and made doubly inviting by the sweet mystery of night sounds, the gasping and gurgling of the water, the splashing of distant fish, the muted cries of night birds, particularly the peet-peet of the nighthawk and the eerie call of the whippoorwill, and the countless mysterious sounds from the underbrush and the river bottoms, I extended my walk much farther than I had originally intended, so that it was shortly after midnight when I approached the house again, and the moon was close upon the western horizon. As I came quietly along in the now still night, my eye caught a movement in the shadowy distance. The movement had come from the region of the large old elm which pressed close upon the house near the library window, and it was upon this tree that I now fixed my eyes. I had not long to wait, for presently a shadow detached itself from the giant bole and went slowly around the house toward the darkness behind. I could see the figure quite clearly, though I did not once catch sight of its face, despite the fact that the man, for man it was, wore no hat. He walked with a slight limp, and wore a long black cape. He was near medium height, but quite bent, so that his back was unnaturally hunched. His hands were strikingly white in the fading light of the moon, and he walked with a peculiar flapping motion, despite his obvious limp. He passed beyond the house with me at his heels, for I was determined to ascertain, if possible, what design had brought him to the old house. I lost sight of him for a few moments while I gained the shelter of the house, but in a minute I saw him again, and with a gasp of astonishment realized that he was making directly for the vault in which my Uncle Amos lay buried. I stifled an impulse to shout at him, and made my way cautiously in the shadow of a row of lilac bushes towards the vault, before which he was now standing. The darkness here was intense, owing to the fact that the trees with the surrounding copse pressed close upon this corner of the estate, yet I could see from my crouching position that the mysterious intruder was fumbling with the seals of the vault. My purpose in following him so closely was to collar him while he was engaged with the seals, but this design was now for the moment thwarted by his stepping back to survey the surface of the vault door. He remained standing in silence for some while, and I had almost decided that it might be just as easy to capture him in this position when he moved forward once more. But this time he did not fumble with the seals. Instead, he seemed to flatten himself against the door of the vault. Then, incredibly as it may seem, his figure began to grow smaller, to shrink save for his gaunt and gleaming white fingers and arms. With a strangled gasp, I sprang forward. My memory at this point is not quite clear. I remember seizing the outstretched fingers of the man at the vault door, feeling something within my grasp. Then something struck me at the same moment that the intruder whirled and leaped away. I had the fleeting impression that a second person had leaped upon me from behind. I went down like a log. I came to my senses not quite an hour later, and lay for a moment recalling what had happened. I remembered having made a snatch at the intruder's fingers and being struck. There was an appreciable soreness of the head and a sensitive bruise on my forehead when I felt for it. But what most drew my attention was a thing that I held tightly in my left hand. The hand which had grasped the strangely white fingers of the creature pressed against the door of the Wilder vault. I had felt it within my grasp from the first moment of consciousness, but from its roughness I had taken it for a small twig caught up from the lawn. In consequence, it was not until I reached the security of the house that I looked at it. I threw it upon the table in the dim glow of the table lamp, and almost fell in my utter amazement, for the thing I had held in my hand was a fragment of human bone, the unmistakable first two joints of the little finger. This discovery loosed a flood of futile conjectures. Was it after all a man I had surprised at the vault, or was it something else? That my uncle was in some way vitally concerned now became apparent, if it had not been entirely so before. The fact that Amos Wilder had looked for some such interruption of his repose in the old vault led me to believe that whatever he feared derived from some source in the past. Accordingly, I gave up all conjecture for the time, and promised myself that in the morning I would set on foot inquiries designed to make me familiar with my secluded uncle's past life. I was destined to receive a shock in the morning. Determined to prosecute my curiosity concerning my uncle without loss of time, I summoned Jacob Kinney, whose surliness had noticeably increased during the few days I had been at the older. Instead of asking directly about my uncle, I began with a short account of the figure I had seen outside the preceding night. "I was out quite late last night, Jake," I began, "and when I came home I noticed a stranger on the grounds." Kinney's eyebrows shot up in an undisguised curiosity, but he said nothing, though he began to exhibit signs of uneasiness which he did not escape my notice. He was about 5 feet tall, I should say, and wore no hat. I went on. He wore a long black cape and walked with a slight limp. Abruptly, Kinney came to his feet, his eyes wide with fear.
What's that you say? He demanded hoarsely. Walk with a limp or a cape?
I nodded and would have continued my narrative had not Kinney cut in.
My God, he exclaimed, Andrew Bentley's back.
"Who's Andrew Bentley?" I asked, but Kinney did not hear. He had whirled abruptly and run from the room as fast as his feeble legs would allow him to go. My astonishment knew no bounds, nor did subsequent events in any way lessen it, for Jacob Kinney ran not only from the house, but from the grounds, and his flight was climaxed shortly after by the appearance of a begrimed young youth, representing himself as the old man's nephew, who came for Uncle Jake's things, and from him I learned that Kinney was leaving his position at once and would forfeit any wages due him, plus any amount I thought fit to recompense me for his precipitate flight. Kinney's unaccountable action served only to sharpen my already keen interest, and I descended upon Mrs. Selden post haste, but the information which she was able to offer me was meagre indeed. Andrew Bentley had arrived in the neighborhood only a few years back. He and my uncle had immediately become friends, and their friendship, despite an appearance of strain, had ended only when Bentley mysteriously disappeared about a year ago. She confirmed my description of the figure I had seen as that of Bentley. Mrs. Selden, too, was inexplicably agitated, and when I sought to probe for the source of this agitation, she said only that there were some very strange stories extant about Bentley, and that about my uncle as well, and that most of the people in the neighborhood had been relieved of a great fear when Bentley disappeared from the farm adjoining the Wilder House estate. This farm, which he had inhabited for the years of his residence, but had not worked, had yet always managed to exist without trouble, was now uninhabited. This, together with a passing hint that Thomas Weatherby might be able to add something, was the sum of what Mrs. Selden knew. I lost no time in telephoning Weatherby and making an appointment for that afternoon. On the way to the attorney's office, I had ample time to think over the events of the last 10 days. That it was Andrew Bentley whom my uncle Amos had referred to when he spoke so cryptically with me before his death, I had no longer any doubt. Evidently, then, he too feared his strange neighbor, but how he hoped to thwart any attempt that Bentley might make to get the body, for what reason he might want it, could not guess. With black magic was beyond my comprehension. Thomas Weatherby was a short and rather insignificant man, but his attitude was conducive to business, and he made clear to me that he had only a limited time at my disposal. I came directly to the matter of Andrew Bentley. "Andrew Bentley," began Weatherby with some reluctance, "was a man with whom I had no dealings, with whom I cared to have none. I have seldom met any one whose mere presence was so innately evil. Your uncle took up with him, it is true, but I believe he regretted it to the end of his days." What exactly was wrong with Bentley? I cut in. Weatherby smiled grimly, regarding me speculatively for a moment or two, and said, Bentley was an avowed sorcerer. Oh, come, I said. That sort of thing isn't believed in anymore. But a horrible suspicion began to grow in my mind. Perhaps not generally, replied Weatherby at once, but I can assure you that most of us around here believe in the power of black magic after even so short an acquaintance as ours with Andrew Bentley. Consider for a moment that you have spent the greater part of your life in a modern city, away from the countrysides where such beliefs flourish, Wilder. He stopped with an abrupt gesture and took a portfolio from a cabinet. From this he took a photograph, looked at it with a slight curl of disgust on his lips, and passed it over to me. It was a snapshot, apparently made surreptitiously of Andrew Bentley, and had been taken evidently at considerable risk after sunset, for the general appearance of the picture led me to assume that its vagueness was caused by the haziness of dusk, a supposition which Weatherby confirmed. The figure, however, was quite clear, save for blurred arms, which had evidently been moving during the exposure, and for the head. The view had been taken from the side and showed Andrew Bentley, certainly identified for me by the long cape he wore, standing as if in conversation with someone. Yet it struck me as strange that Bentley could have stood quietly during the exposure with no incentive to do so, and I commented upon it at once. Weatherby looked at me queerly. Wilder, he said, there was another person there, or should I say thing, and this thing was directly in line with the lens, for he was standing very close to Bentley, and yet there's nothing on the snapshot, nor is there any evidence on the exposed negative itself that any one stood there, for as you can see, the landscape is unbroken. It was as he said. But this other person, I put in, he was seen and yet does not appear. Apparently the camera was out of focus or the film was defective. On the contrary, there are logical explanations for the non-appearance of something on a film. You can't photograph a dream, and you can't photograph something that has no material form. I say material advisedly, even though our own eyes give that thing a physical being. What do you mean? Father Burkhart would call it a familiar, he said, clipping his words. A familiar, in case you don't know, is an evil spirit summoned by a sorcerer to wait upon his desires. That tall, gaunt man was never seen by day, always by night, and never without Bentley. I can give you no more of my time now, but if you can bring yourself to accept what I have to say at face value, I'll be glad to see you again. My interview with Thomas Weatherby left me considerably shaken, and I found myself discarding all my previously formed beliefs regarding black magic. I went immediately to my late uncle's store of books and began to read through them for further information, in the hope that something I might learn would enable me to meet Andrew Bentley on more equal footing should he choose to call. I read until far into the night, and what inconceivable knowledge I assimilated lingers clearly in my mind as I write. I read of the age-old horror summoned from the abyss by the ignorance of men, of cosmic ghouls that roam the ether in search of prey, and of countless things that walk by night. There are many legends of familiars, ghastly demons called forth from the depths of the whims of long-dead sorcerers, and it was significant that each legend had been heavily scored along the margins, and in one case the name Andrew Bentley was written in my uncle's hand. In another place my uncle had written, "We are fools to play with the powers of whose scope even the wisest of us has no knowledge." It was at this point that it occurred to me that my uncle had left a letter of sealed instructions for me in case the vault was tampered with. This letter was to be in the library desk, where I found it with little trouble. A long, legal-looking envelope with my name inscribed very formally. The handwriting was undoubtedly my uncle's, and the letter within was the thing that finally dispelled all doubt from my mind as to the reality of the sorcery that had been and was still being practiced near the Wilder homestead. For it made clear what had happened between my uncle and Andrew Bentley, and that other.
My dear Ellis, if indeed they have come for me, as they must have if you read this, there is but one thing you can do. Bentley's body must be found and utterly destroyed. Surely there cannot be much left of it. Now, perhaps you have seen him in the night when he walks, as I have. He is not alive. I know because I killed him a year ago. I stabbed him with your grandfather's hunting knife, which must yet lie in his black skeleton. I think both Burkhardt and Weatherby suspected that I aided Bentley to his black rites, but that was long before I dreamed of what depths of evil lurked in his soul. And when he began to hound me so, when he brought forth that hellish thing he had conjured up from the nethermost places of evil, could I do otherwise than rid myself of his evil presence? My mind was at stake, and yes, my body. When you read this, only my body is at stake, for they want it. Conceive, if you can, the ghastly irony of my lifeless body given an awful new existence by being inhabited by Bentley's familiar. The body, Bentley's body, I put it in the vault, but that other removed it and hid it somewhere on the grounds. I have not been able to find it, and this past year has been a living hell for me. They've hounded me nightly, and though I can protect myself from them, I cannot stop them from appearing to taunt me. And when I am dead, my protection must come from you. But I hope that Burkhardt will close his eyes and bless the vault, for this I think will be strong enough to keep them away. And yet, I cannot tell. And perhaps even this is being read too late, for if once they have my body, destroy me too with Bentley's remains, by fire. Amos Wilder. I put down this letter and sat for a moment in silence, but what thoughts crowded upon my mind were interrupted by an odd sound from outside the window, a sound that was unnaturally striking in the still night. I glanced at my watch. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Then I turned out the small reading lamp and moved quietly towards the window, immediately beyond which stood the giant elm beneath which on the previous night I had first seen the ghostly figure of Andrew Bentley. For since he had been killed a year before, what I had seen could have been none other than his spectre. Then a thought struck me that paralyzed me with horror. Suppose I had been struck by that other? It seemed to me that the blow which had knocked me out had been struck from behind. At the same instant my eyes caught sight of the faintest movement beyond the window. The moon hung in a hazy sky and threw a faint illumination about the tree, despite the fairly heavy shadow of its overhanging limbs. There was a man pressed close to the bole of the tree, and even as I looked another seemed to rise up out of the ground at his side, and the second man was Andrew Bentley. I looked again at the first and saw a tall, gaunt figure with malevolent red eyes, through whom I could see the line of moonlight and shadow on the lawn beyond the tree. They stood there together for only a moment, and then went quickly around the house towards the vault. From that instant events moved rapidly to a climax. My eyes fixed themselves upon that place in the ground from which the figure of Andrew Bentley had sprung, and saw there an opening in the trunk of the old tree, for the elm was hollow, and its bole held the remains of Andrew Bentley. Small wonder that my uncle had been haunted by the presence of the man he had killed when his remains were hidden in the tree near the library window. But I stood there only for a fraction of a minute. Then I went quickly to the telephone, and after an agonizing delay got Weatherby on the wire and asked him to come out at once, hinting enough of what was happening to gain his assent. I suggested also that he bring Father Burkhardt along, and this he promised to do. Then I slipped silently from the house into the shadowy garden. I think the sight of those two unholy figures hovering about the door of the vault was too much for me, for I launched myself at them, heedless of my danger. But realization came almost instantly, for Andrew Bentley did not even turn at my appearance. Instead, the other looked abruptly around, fixed me with his red and fiery eyes, smiled wickedly so that his leathery face was weirdly creased, and leisurely watched me approach. Instinct, I believe, whirled me about and sent me flying from the garden. The thing was somewhat surprised at my abrupt bolt, and this momentary hesitation on its part I continue to believe is responsible for my being alive to write this, for I knew that I was flying for my life, and I ran with the utmost speed of which I was capable.
A fleeting glance showed me that the thing loped after me, a weirdly flapping shape seeming to come with the wind in the moonlight night, and struck shuddery horror into my heart. I made for the river because I remembered reading in one of my uncle's old books that certain familiars could not cross water unless accompanied by those whose sorcery had summoned them to earth. I leaped into the cold water, tense with the hope that the thing could not follow. It could not. I saw it raging up and down along the river bank, impotent and furious at my fortunate escape, while I kept myself afloat in mid-current. The current carried me rapidly downstream, and I kept my eyes fixed upon the thing I had eluded until it turned and sped back towards the vault. Only when I was completely out of its sight did I make for the bank once more. I ran madly down the road along which Weatherby and the priest must come, flinging off some of my wet clothes as I went. What was happening at the vault I did not know. At the moment my only thought was temporary safety from the thing whose power I had so thoughtlessly challenged. I had gone perhaps a half-mile beyond the estate when the headlights of Weatherby's car swept around a curve and outlined me in the road. The car ground to an emergency stop, and Weatherby's voice called out. I jumped into the car and explained as rapidly as I could what had happened. Father Burkhardt regarded me quizzically, half smiling. "You've had a narrow escape, my boy," he said. "A very narrow escape. Now if only we can get to the vault before they succeed in their evil design. Such a fate is too harsh a punishment even for the sins of Amos Wilder." He shuddered as he spoke, and Weatherby's face was grim. None of us wasted a moment when the car came to a stop near the house. Father Burkhardt, despite his age, led the way, marshalling us behind him, for he went ahead with a crucifix extended. But even he faltered at the horrifying sight that met our eyes when we rounded the house and came into the garden, for the vault was open, and from it emerged the skeletal Bentley and his familiar, and between them they dragged the lifeless body of my uncle Amos. Burkhardt's hesitation, however, was only momentary, for he ran forward immediately, nor were Weatherby and I far behind. At the same moment the two at the vault caught sight of us. With a shrill scream, the tall, gaunt thing loosed his hold of the corpse and launched himself forward. But the crucifix served us well, for the thing fell shuddering away from it. Father Burkhardt immediately pressed his advantage, and following his sharp command, Weatherby and I rushed at Bentley, who had up to this moment remained beside the corpse, still keeping hold of one dead arm. But at our advance, Bentley wavered a moment, and then turned and took flight, jogging nimbly past us and running for the house. We were at his heels and saw him when he vanished in the deep shadows of the tree near the library window. Father Burkhardt presently made his appearance, walking warily, for the thing was still at bay but eager to attack. "Find the bones," directed the priest. "They're in the tree, I suspect." I bent obediently, and presently my searching hand encountered a scooped-out hollow in the trunk, just above the opening at the base of the tree. In this lay the skeleton of Andrew Bentley, together with the weapon by which he had met his death. And here it had lain ever since the thing Bentley had summoned from the depths had removed the sorcerer's body from the old vault. Small wonder that it had never been discovered. Father Burkhardt stood protectingly close while Weatherby and I prepared a pyre to consume the remains of the sorcerer. "But what can we do about that?" I asked once, pointing to the familiar that now raged in baffled fury just beyond us. "We need not bother about that," said the priest. "He is held to earth only by the body of the man who summoned him from below. When once that body is destroyed, he must return. That's why they were after your uncle's body. If the familiar could inhabit a body fresh from a new grave, he could walk by day as well as by night, and need have no fear of having to return." Once or twice the thing did rush at us, but each time its charge was arrested by the power of the crucifix held unfalteringly aloft by Father Burkhardt, and each time the thing shrank away, wailing. It was over at last, but not without a short period of ghastly doubt. The remains of Andrew Bentley were reduced to ashes, utterly destroyed, and yet the thing Bentley had called from outside lingered beyond us, strangely quiet now, regarding us malevolently. "I don't understand," admitted Father Burkhardt at last. Now that Bentley's ashes alone remain, the thing should go back into the depths. But if the priest did not understand, I did. Abruptly, I ran to the library window, raised it as far as it would go, and scrambled into the room. In a moment I emerged, bearing the fragment of Bentley's little finger which I had snatched from the skeletal hand the night before. I threw it into the flames already dying down in the shadow of the tree. In a moment it had caught fire, and at the same instant the thing hovering near gave a chilling scream of pain and fury, pushed madly toward us, and then abruptly shot into space and vanished like the last fragment of an unholy, ghastly nightmare. Requiescent in pace, said Father Burkhardt softly, looking at the ashes at our feet, but the dubious expression in his eyes conveyed his belief that for the now released spirit of Andrew Bentley, a greater and longer torture had just begun. The veil has lifted, if only for a moment. If you felt the chill of the unknown, the whisper of something ancient in the dark, then you've walked with us into the strange. Until next time, keep your lantern lit and your mind opened. The weird is never far.